that does what we expect it to do. So now we've come to the question and answer period for today's event. And while I describe the format of this session, let me invite our 5 academic panelists to join me on the stage here in front of the podium and get started. So for reporters and science writers who are online, you've been invited to submit your questions to the website, to our email address, poor-quality-meds@unc.edu, or via Twitter at UNC Public Health, #BadMedsKill. So my colleague David Pesci will be reading some questions to me, and I will then direct those questions to the appropriate author, either in the room or on the phone. Again, we have up to 15 people on the phone who are participating in response to as corresponding authors for the papers in the supplement or who have been involved in this activity. So thank you again for participating, and let me go to David for the first question.
Sure, and why don't we start with Dr. Adiran, since you just finished? Your paper says people are being murdered by medicine. Isn't this an exaggeration just to grab attention to a problem that is not really that important? You'd think that if it were so important, the FDA, the WHO, and the European Union would be on it like white on rice. How do you respond?
It's absolutely not an exaggeration. The fact is that if you intentionally kill somebody, and some of the criminals involved here have put intentionally toxic substances in drugs, murder fits as a concept. Now, we have to be very clear that the ability of institutions to act on this is shaped by the political environment they're in. I think the FDA has tried very hard to address this problem. They haven't always succeeded, but it has not been for lack of good intentions. Some other organizations have been thwarted by their internal politics. The World Health Organization did try to address this problem a number of years ago. They fell prey to an unfortunate argument in which intellectual property of medicines, patent rights of medicines, was wrapped in with the medicine quality issues. And of course, that's a very controversial issue. It ended up sinking the discussions, miring them in a way that's not productive. Most recently, the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, disclosure, I consulted for them last year, tried to take on this problem, and they made extremely serious errors in their approach, including one that would have criminalized the use of placebos in clinical trials. So when institutions don't get it, when they conflate intellectual property with medicine quality, for instance, when they have other agendas, things don't move forward as much as we'd like. That's just politics. This issue is not exempt of politics.
Thank you, sir. Jim,
Actually,
is
I think
Dr.
we have a
Mackey?
question here in the room from Karen Oleski. You were going to ask a question earlier.
Yes, thank you for some provocative ideas and concepts that we've been talking about today. You know, I think about your statement earlier about what Americans and the drugs they take. You know, what does this bigger issue mean to Americans and to Congress?
It's a very good
Just to repeat it, make sure everyone heard online, what does this question mean to Americans and to Congress as you've described it? Thank you.
Well, I mean, our drug regulatory laws in the United States come from an earlier era. In fact, our Modern Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act came about in 1938 after, in the United States, an episode of fake medicine killed about roughly 100 people. Now, since that time, globalization has happened. And we're now no longer relying on medicines made in the United States or made in Europe or made in Canada. We're relying on medicines from countries that don't regulate to a certain standard. We need to reform our laws in this country to ensure that regardless of where medicines are coming from, a minimum standard of safety is kept. I would say that our 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is obsolete in this respect. That's before globalization, really. We need to begin regulating the pharmaceutical industry the way we do airlines. When a foreign airline flies into the United States, we don't worry about its quality. We don't worry that British Airways is bad or Kenya Airways is bad or Thai Airways is bad. We're very confident in them. And the reason is they don't get landing rights in the United States unless their home governments regulate the industry appropriately. What we're doing now is we're chasing after one bad medicine and the next and the next and the next, chasing pill by pill. That won't work. We need to chase individual governments and use American diplomatic power to chase individual governments to raise the regulatory standards across the board. That is how true safety will be achieved. It's a challenge for Congress. It's something they need to be lobbied on and educated on, but it's really the only path forward. That's why airplanes are safe. Medicines really aren't.
Thank you, Professor Atron. David.
Okay, we have one for Dr. Tim Mackey from the University of California at San Diego, who I believe is on the phone.
Yes.
Dr. Mackey, your study reports on data submitted to the Pharmaceutical Society Institute's Counterfeit Incident System, CIS. What companies report to this system, and is what they report truly representative of the problem of falsified medicines?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead and speak up a bit.
Okay, great. Sure. So this is Tim Mackey. Thanks for the interesting question and the good question. So PSI-CIS pulls information from all types of sources, not just its particular members. And in our particular report, the majority of the reports that we found were actually from health agencies. So, the question about whether the sample is representative is a very good one, because potentially, because you have this different mix of sources, you're biasing the sample. And I'm sure that's what's happening because we have some of the top 5 countries being China, et cetera. And I think kind of the perverse mechanism that's going on here is if you're more actively surveilling for counterfeit drugs, you're obviously going to have more reports. And of course, the PSI members themselves are going to be surveilling for medicines that are proprietary to them. So that could bias the sample as well. But on that side, we found anti-infectives were the most highly counterfeited category, which is not necessarily something that a lot of these PSI members are looking for. It's probably they're looking for the more NCDs or the more proprietary drugs for, cardiovascular disease or even other NCDs. So we believe that, the bottom line of the report is that better surveillance is necessary, and there is a need for multi-stakeholder representation in the sample, and we have to balance, how that sample looks like. So a lot of work is needed to get better data on it, but unfortunately, the PSI data set is some of the best we have, and indeed it was used by the Institute of Medicine's report as well on a case study basis. So we really need a global effort for counterfeit drug surveillance. That's what we need, and it needs to get better.
Great, thanks, Tim, very much for that. David.
Okay, another one for the panel. Dr. Bremen, you state that no active ingredient in an anti-malarial drug can lead to resistant malaria parasites, and this threatens all gains made in the last decade by the President's Malaria Initiative and the Global Fund in fighting malaria. How is it that no active ingredient can cause parasite resistance? Excuse me.
There are 3 mechanisms by which resistance can occur and spread. There is selection. If a drug is given and the sensitive parasites are eliminated and then you have resistance. There is mutation, which we all know can occur in the face of a compound. But also, if patients have resistant organisms already there and the drug they receive does no good, then, for instance, for malaria, the mosquitoes can pick up continually the infective forms and spread those. Now, there is discussion on how important that mechanism is, but that's simply the way that organisms can spread. And with people traveling all over these malarious areas, that poses a big danger. So we have to worry about no drug being given to patients with resistant organisms and having the infective form maintained for sometimes weeks in that condition.
Fair enough.
Thank you, Dr. Bremen.
Okay, we have one for Aileen Plancon from Interpol. And
Let's see if she's actually,
she on today?
Aline or your colleague, are you on the line from Interpol? She may not be, so.
Okay, we will forward that one by email. So, and pardon me if I'm mispronouncing these names as well, but for Gurvika Nayar, okay. You published a paper in The Lancet a couple years ago that exposed the extent of falsified and substandard antimalarials. You reported that almost 33% of antimalarials found in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa were fake. In this supplement, you describe the need for international convention or treaty like the Framework Convention for Tobacco Control, FCTC. It took almost 12 years for the FCTC to be realized. What will it take to get an international convention, and will it take more than a decade to achieve?
I hope not. I think I'd start with that. And it's lucky that we have Amir here, who also has some knowledge on, our recommendation of the International Convention as something that he's also commented on widely. But essentially, the need for an international convention is parallel to the need with national law. We need both a top-down and bottom-up approach to address sort of the regulatory challenges in a lot of these countries. The fact that the Tobacco Convention took a really long time is that, there was a lot of, I think, pushback from the tobacco industry on, making a case for why, cigarettes still may have been, safe in some instances, et cetera. I would say, while we do have the pharmaceutical industry that is also involved in this topic, they're all for, in a way, to have safe, good quality medicines on the field. So I think we're more fortunate in that instance. However, intellectual property law does sort of complicate that relationship and that push forward a little bit. But I think that all people, I would hope, in the world believe that poor quality medicines, them being on the market, are bad for consumers and bad for patients. And the pharmaceutical industry that is selling these are very much on, find this in their interest as well. So I think some of that pushback is less, but we do have political complications within that and political climate of the regulatory and the national laws that come into play. And Amir, do you have any comments on that?
Why is it that we're sitting here talking about medicine crime and what commonly is referred to as, quote, counterfeit medicine? It's because there's no law. That's my point. There's been an international treaty against counterfeit money since 1929. And that's why, someone hands you a few dollars at the checkout, you don't worry about whether it's fake, do you? When was the last time you got a counterfeit $10 bill? It probably has never happened to you in your life. Because the law's been there since 1929. If we're serious about solving this problem with medicine, we need to get to where we were in 1929 with money. Now, will that take a decade, was your question? It might not. It depends on the political will that is placed behind this. I have seen a great deal of misexpenditure and misallocation of political will because stupid mistakes were made, such as to conflate intellectual property with medicine quality, as Gorvika says. These are avoidable errors. 90% of the pharmaceutical industry is on side with not repeating those errors. There are some companies in disagreement. Sanofi is the most notorious example that is pursuing an inappropriate agenda on this subject, but the rest of the industry seems to be on side. We can solve this. This is not like fighting big tobacco. Everyone wants medicines to be safe.
Thank you. Did you
No, go ahead.
Yes? Okay, I was going to say, we have one for Patricia Tabanero from Oxford. Your study in Laos shows dramatic reduction in trade and use of, and I'm going to say this wrong, artesunate monotherapy, something like 23% to only 5%. What is the reason for this reduction?
Well, I think patients have better access to healthcare to what they have 9 years ago. And there's been many changes by the Lao government. They're putting a big effort into updating their regulation or the law. and to monitor the quality of medicines that the patients actually take. They're also having many organizations have helped the government, many governments in Southeast Asia. So you have different sentinel sites that they check, they monitor the medicines regularly, and they have updated the guidelines for good quality manufacturing, distribution, and storage of the medicines. So actually, artesunate also, it has stopped. It was illegal in Laos since 2008. So patients, now there's the public-private mix program as well, where patients can get a rapid diagnostic test, a test for malaria, and an ACT in the public sector for free. So basically, I think patients, they have better access and they can get good quality medicines. They're easier for them.
If I could comment, that's actually a good example of where regulation being put in place to take monotherapy artesunate off the shelves has actually accomplished what it was supposed to. So I think that's what we're seeing here. When countries do step up and actually take that action, you will see this reduction as Ms. Tabinell's paper has identified. David.
Yes, we have one for Dr. Carr. You led 2 studies, one in Tanzania and one in Cambodia, bless you, as reported in this supplement. Is the problem of falsified and substandard drugs equally bad in both these countries, or is one country doing a better job of protecting their drug supply chain? If so, what did you observe that leads to this conclusion?
Thank you very much for this very exciting question. And I will call on my co-authors who are actually online as well, Shinmei Jung from Cambodia, to add to what I have to say, and Catherine Goodman, who is from Tanzania. What we found were, as I said, 31% of the drugs in Cambodia were substandard. And this is mainly because we actually looked at all of the drugs that were on sale and we analyzed them. And Shinmei, if you want to add more to that?
Shunmei, are you online?
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead and speak up a bit.
Let me just put my volume. How's that?
Much better.
Great. I think it's difficult to. I think the question was about comparing the 2 countries, and I think it's difficult to kind of make a comparison. I think for the Cambodia samples, I think we were relieved to see that there were no falsified medicines. We were concerned about the numbers of substandard, meaning that they contained less than 80% of the stated active pharmaceutical ingredient. And we were looking at, and we tried to look at the risk factors for it. And one of them was related to expiry dates. And I think another reassuring thing, perhaps, is to say that the first-line drug, which in the private sector at the time was artesunate mefloquine, and that did better. So we had better results with that than the non-first-line drugs. So in particular, the kind of artemisinin monotherapies. I guess when you look at if you just look at the kind of 31% versus 12% as it was for Tanzania, it looks like the quality of the drugs were worse in Cambodia. But I think we have to go into a little bit more detail in terms of the timing and the categories of the drugs.
I'd like to add to that as Shinmei mentioned. Sorry, is there another one? The fact that the drugs in Cambodia were artesunate mefloquine, whereas in Tanzania what we've got is a whole array of drugs. It's not just those 2. It's dihydroartemisinin piperacin, we've got Coartem from Novartis, and we've got all the others that we analyzed. So there was at least many different brands that were, so comparing like for like doesn't really come into it here.
Okay.
I hope that answers the question.
I hope so too.
Thank you.
We have another one, and it's for the panel. It's from an online person. It's rather general, but we can get as specific as we like. Who is producing the bad meds, and what are the most common types of diseases, illnesses the meds are intended to treat or cure? Is it simply malaria, or is it well beyond malaria? Anyone?
Maybe Dr. Brennan.
Yeah, let me begin, and this is really a phantom industry in many ways. Paradoxically, the fake meds are being produced in countries, India and China have been mentioned often, they've been tracked, but these also produce the good medicines that we're buying. So these fly-by-night operations, these facilities, can be produced by people who might know some of the technology, and then they're gone. So if we had these legal requirements that we've talked about, we might know more about who's producing them. And they go where the money is. Malaria is low cost, very high volume in places where a child may have 3 or 4 episodes of fever per year and be treated with what the families think are good drugs. Now, elsewhere, the very popular drugs that folks from the Pharmaceutical Security Institute and individual companies have found are the erectile dysfunction, the hypercholesterolemia, other anti-infective drugs, antimicrobials, and then hypertension, Alzheimer's disease, you name it, they're out there. Diagnostics, strips for diabetes, even some rapid diagnostic tests. And then vaccines have been faked. Yellow fever vaccines have been contaminated and elsewhere. So those are the drugs that they address. And that's the answer to your question.
All right. Dr. Adler?
Yeah, I want to just tell one story that illustrates, no, it's not only malaria. The reason you hear so much about malaria is the people in the malaria field are always very sensitive to the quality of drugs because of the fear of drug resistance, and there's some very intelligent people here. So I think the malaria field is out ahead on this problem, but it's not just malaria. Let me give you an example. Oxytocin and ergometrin. These are what we call uterotonic drugs. You will give them to a woman who is in labor or shortly after delivering, in some cases to prevent hemorrhage after she delivers. So as you know, a certain number of deliveries go badly for the woman and she gives birth and starts bleeding and bleeding and bleeding, and she can bleed to death. It's a major cause of maternal mortality. Well, in the studies, the few studies that have been done, oxytocin and ergometrin appear to be probably the most targeted medicines out there. And in one study by the USP in Ghana, over half the oxytocin and something like 70% of the ergometrin was either substandard or fake in Ghana. Over half. Now, you think about this in a birth setting. A woman has given birth. It's supposed to be the happiest day for the family and for her. And she starts hemorrhaging. She might have minutes to live. If you don't deal with that hemorrhage, she's dead, and there's an orphan. And half the drugs we're giving her are garbage. Now, in that study, the medicines, most of them came from China and India. That tells you something.
Right. I think we have maybe one more question, David.
I do. Is Myra Lieberman from Notre Dame on today?
Abigail Weaver, her co-author, is online from Notre Dame. Yes.
Okay. Abigail, the paper test cards described by Dr. Lieberman sound like a really great and inexpensive tool to identify, to detect substandard and fake antimalarials. What is the potential for scale-up and widespread use of this tool, and what are the limiting factors?
Yes, this is Abigail Weaver from the University of Notre Dame, and using the paper test cards, indeed, we think is an inexpensive way to reach this problem in places where it's difficult to test. We have designed the cards so you can just use a small amount of water and you don't need hazardous chemicals, and we see them being useful in locations like warehouses, clinics, pharmaceuticals, and we could put these in the hands of pharmacists, and indeed they could use those. we're working now with testing these in the field, and so scaling up is indeed a difficult problem. Looking at going from academics and then into manufacturing is a difficult problem and requires lots of studies and funding, and so that's something we're certainly working on. The test cards work very well when ingredients are substituted and missing and new unexpected things are added, but they're not quite as well if there's, for example, just a small reduction in the amount of the active ingredient, and so we're looking at improving that. But we have some of these in the field and people are using them, and we think they have great promise to indeed put some power into the consumer. When hospitals are buying pharmaceuticals, we can give them a tool that can help them see a little bit about the pharmaceutical they're buying before they purchase it.
Thanks, Dr. Weaver, for that response. I think it really speaks to the real potential for students to think about what are the innovations, the techniques that could be developed in order to give the consumer the power they need in order to be reassured that the product that they're receiving is in fact the genuine product. I think this is a real opportunity for students in our schools to really think about what might be possible and bring in venture capitalists to help them scale these products up for use, certainly in the developing world. So let me just close the question and answer session today.